Welcome back to a special extended edition of Focus One. Today we're going to be talking about immigration with my friend and colleague, Dr. Keith Fitzgerald. This will be the first in a series of programs on immigration reform. There is currently a major push in Congress to pass legislation that will comprehensively reform the nation's immigration policy. The ultimate outcome of this legislative push, regardless of what it is, will likely shape the 2014 congressional midterm elections as well as the 2016 presidential race. It is also likely to reverberate in state and local politics for the next few years. Our Focus One immigration series will try to cut through some of the rhetoric and facilitate an informed discussion and debate. This initial program is meant to break down the prospective legislation as well as provide some historical and contemporary background to the topic of immigration and immigration policy. We will also be taping programs that focus more sharply on economic impacts of both legal and illegal immigration, as well as on the state and local law enforcement issues associated with undocumented workers. We will culminate the series with an hour-long panel discussion that includes both proponents and opponents of what is now being referred to as the Gang of Eight proposal. To start us off, I brought back a former guest, Dr. Keith Fitzgerald, a former Florida House representative and Democratic nominee for Congress. Keith is a man of many talents, one being his academic expertise on the topic of immigration. Welcome back to the show, Keith.
Thanks.
Let's just start us off. Both of you are pretty active in terms of research, teaching at New College, and doing a lot of applied stuff in the community. Haven't published too many books, but you've published a couple, your dissertation and then a big one. And what was the topic?
It was immigration policy.
There you go.
How
we're not just making this up on the fly. You are a bona fide academic expert on immigration.
Yeah, and I've written a few things over the years about it. And one of the things that I think is a little bit, people are very skeptical about, is that when we do our political science job, you put a very different frame of mind into effect than when you're involved in politics. So when I did my immigration work in my dissertation and in my book, it was very analytical. And it was very difficult, I think, to discern if you read those pieces of work, what my politics were, what my preferences were as far as policy was concerned.
We're not trained to do that. I mean,
right.
They take in graduate school, the science part of it's not about politics. You're not going to study necessarily politics, although it's the science part. So what you're trained and what you're rewarded for is being able to actually, collect data, form a question, and be able to come up with a valid answer to that question. The implications for policy, that's nice little, at the end, but it's not a venue or a platform to be espousing, advocating.
What you're absolutely not doing is trying to advocate a specific approach to some kind of policy. In fact, what my book was about, as much as anything, is how choices, institutional choices, bureaucratic arrangements, legal arrangements that were made in one time shaped the political climate of later generations. Mm-hmm. So that you could sort of see how history was operating behind people's backs, shaped the political climate, the institutional climate for later actors, so that in a sense that they could understand the issues as maybe a little broader than what was right before their nose. And I think that's a good function for academics to play. But when I ran for office, people would get that book and they'd have the opposition research people go over it and over it and over it, and they really couldn't squeeze any politics out of it because I wasn't advocating a left, right, or any kind of position.
What were some of maybe the takeaways for the layperson that had picked up there, might have picked up your book, not necessarily the academic or this person that's vested or steeped in American political development, but just somebody that was interested in immigration? What were some of the take-home points?
Yeah, I think one of the things that people find really interesting is really from a history standpoint is that we have been here before. Mm-hmm. If you went back to the beginning of the 20th century, you would find that there were people who were quite concerned about the large number of immigrants that are in this country, the diversity of those immigrants, the different kinds of backgrounds they represented, what people perceived as backgrounds that were too foreign with respect to the political, moral, and cultural values that they had. There was a great deal of concern that Southern Europeans would never be able to assimilate with Northeastern, Northwestern Europeans. There were too many Catholics, too many Jews. People with those kind of backgrounds could not possibly ever become good Americans. And there were a lot of concerns that they would be taking away jobs and depressing the wage rates. So all of those issues were at the top of the political agenda.
It's Groundhog's Day.
And you look at where we are now, and although the faces have changed, a lot of the arguments against immigration are very similar. Ironically, in some cases, they'll be made by the descendants of some of the groups who in the past were told could never assimilate in the United States. And that might tip off my own sense that some of the concerns that people have really ought to be focusing about how well our political institutions are working and how strong our values are. It's not the existence of somebody from a different culture here, but the strength of the schools, the cultural institutions overall, and the economy, which is the big assimilator.
Absolutely.
So, the United States is, I think, another thing that people should take away is the United States has an unusual model of assimilation when it comes to immigrants. Historically, we've been able to accommodate people maintaining a strong sense of cultural identity that's not mainstream or majoritarian. But people will enter into the political sphere accepting those rules, the liberality, the respect of individual liberties and rights, the respect of process and the rule of law. And so they can remain an Italian or remain a Mexican or what have you in their home sphere, but come into the public sphere and operate as a citizen on equal grounds. And that's something specifically tied to our political institutions. So it's a lot harder in a country where the defining political identity might be nationalism.
Right.
And so we have an opportunity actually to make immigration work in other places where it would be much harder to pull it off.
But we struggle. We continue to struggle. We do have some problems we'll get to in terms of
absolutely
security, whether they be the number of undocumented workers. Again, there's a variety of issues.
The economics have to work. It can cause some real problems to have too many people without the right skill set. So there are all kinds of legitimate issues with immigration. I don't mean to dismiss that. But I am an optimist about the ability of the country to persist and realize its best traditions, not in spite of, but maybe because of immigration.
Before we get to the Gang of Eight proposal, I just want to roll back the clock just a little bit briefly, because again, we have been here before, and a few of the past presidents and administrations have wanted to or taken an attempt to tackle immigration, and it's been largely unsuccessful. Maybe you can just turn the clock back a little bit, and maybe under the Reagan administration or the failed Bush.
And one of the things that scholars tell us about immigration policy, a persistent theme, is that immigration continually cuts across traditional left-right categories. You get a lot of strange bedfellows in immigration. Now, right now, we're in a period where people try really hard to hammer everything into a left-right dialogue.
Immigration doesn't necessarily.
And immigration rarely fits. I mean, there are some other issues, the same thing with some of these security issues. You have libertarians at both ends of the spectrum now agreeing with each other, so it occasionally happens that the left-right model doesn't work. With immigration, it's typical, actually, that it just doesn't fit neatly on a left-right scale.
Maybe we can just scope out some of the key players or stakeholders.
Well, so this is it. There is an ideological dimension, and that can divide people. On the other hand, part of the reason it doesn't work so well is immigration is about constituencies. And those constituencies have to do with where you fit in the economy overall, and also geographical constituencies, which is really important. In the U.S., we have geographical representation. So the people who employ immigrants have some very distinct and very specific interests. Historically, there's been a conflict between labor and employers on immigration. That's a very complicated story. There are some cultural dimensions to this, so there's conflict on those grounds. Some people are uncomfortable with large numbers of people coming in from different cultural backgrounds. That often cuts right across the employment aspect of this thing.
Right.
The geographical dimensions are important because there are some communities in this country that benefit hugely by having large numbers of immigrants come in. And there are others that pay a pretty high price. So towns right around the border, particularly as we've actually succeeded in cutting down on illegal immigration and raised the stakes for how you get in, it pushed a lot of the flow into a much more criminal element. So it used to be fairly easy to get across. A little coyote who was a little entrepreneur who might take 10 or 20 people across could make money doing that. Now increasingly immigrants are brought over by drug cartels. So it's tied into some very dangerous stuff. It makes crime a big issue for some of the border communities. Well, if you're a receiving community somewhere in the interior of the country where you need that labor for agricultural purposes, you may not be so concerned about the cost that it causes some little town on the border. So there are even differences in that respect. So it gets to be very complicated. And I think you can see this, that while maybe Tea Party Republicans have a clear and coherent position on this, the rest of the political spectrum is all over the place.
Let's tease out some, again, on both on the right and the left, but on the right you do have Tea Party Republicans, or simply just Tea Partiers of various ilks that for ideological and other reasons extremely concerned about border security and perhaps perceptions of threat with respect to assimilating large numbers of people. For some, again, they draw a clear line between legal and illegal immigration, but again you have some strong resistance there to immigration reform. One of the huge components, more of the establishment, component of the Republican Party, though, is the business community. Very, very important. And I think, as you note, there may be certainly some that take advantage of undocumented workers and have a vested interest in keeping or maintaining access to that pool of labor. But I think it's important to point out a number of large businesses in the United States certainly don't want to mess their hands up with illegal or undocumented workers. But the chilling effect of both the political rhetoric and any sort of security measures that are taken could actually, again, affect that pool of low-skilled labor that they rely on, even if it's legal. And so they're often at odds with the Tea Party.
I'll tell you a little story that I think illustrates this pretty well. Most people who follow politics, people watching the show probably in that category, know who Grover Norquist is. And soon after 9/11, I attended a seminar at the Center for Immigration Studies, which is a sort of a right-leaning immigration think tank in Washington. The conference was actually, I was in Washington doing research. I contacted CIS and asked them if they had any program. They invited me to this conference. It was comprised largely of staffers from the Hill and members of Congress. It was an all-day affair. Ed Meese, the former Attorney General, was there, a whole variety of academics and so forth. And the entire program was about why conservatives ought to be opposed to immigration. And they made cultural arguments, they made economic arguments. The program went on from 8 in the morning until 11:30, and I watched as an observer of this. At 11:30, the final panel had Grover Norquist on, and he came on and he looked at the audience and he said, "Listen, I've been listening to this stuff all day, and I want you to know the day after the election, after President Bush won, I sat upstairs in this building in the Republican Club with our 12 biggest donors, and the first thing they said to me, whatever you do, don't mess with our labor supply, stay away from this immigration issue." And everybody picked up their stuff and left. That was the end of it. And so I think within the Republican Party, this is a real problem for them just politically, that they have some very passionate people about these issues who think that stopping immigration is the most important thing. But their biggest funders, their biggest donors, their most vested interests do not want
huge economic at stake.
They do not want us messing with because frankly the illegal system has some high costs because of the insecurity and unreliableness of it, because it can shift with the political winds. But essentially, it provides a large stream of a pliable, cheap labor supply.
Right.
And that pliability is important. It's not ripe for unionization. When economic downturns come, you can sort of get rid of them without having to pay unemployment insurance. It's a great deal in a sense, if you discount the social, cultural costs that people may complain about. So they're very resistant to change. And I think part of the political deal that's being struck right now is to the business community, you're going and saying, we're going to set up some stability and regularity to this so that your expectations will be clear. We're also going to be giving you some control over people in a quasi-guest worker program where you will be the chief administrators of it. So you're
trying
actually
to get them on board.
So you're going to get them. But that still causes a problem with people who do not want this to happen at all.
We'll get to that part in a second. I want to swing back too, just to point out that while this is clearly a wedge issue in many respects on the right or for the Republican Party, Democrats are not necessarily in lockstep. Well, right now, as we saw in the last couple of election cycles, the influence of natural legalized immigration with respect to the Hispanic community and what we're seeing happening and what we will continue to see happening for the next few decades in terms of demographics, the Hispanic community, very important to Democratic Party prospects and electoral success in the coming years. 70% of the vote in the last election went to President Obama, and this is a very important issue for that community. But as you mentioned, there's big labor. One of the pillars of Democratic Party, both financial as well as a variety of on-the-ground support. They're not exactly super excited about immigration in many respects because you had mentioned, again, it's non-unionized labor. It's potentially keeps wages or depresses wages. And so, you know, we have our own little wedges on the Democratic side.
Right. And you know, I understand people, since I am active as a political person in the Democratic Party, they might be suspicious of anything I'd say. But you know, I think stepping back and looking at it analytically, this is not as hard an issue as for the Democrats for a couple of reasons, but what you say is true. For the first one is, there is a far left in this country, but it's very, very marginalized, and it's in a very weak position within the Democratic Party to make demands. So there are people who see this entire situation fundamentally as a scheme of labor exploitation, and do not like, for example, that the work program that is in the comprehensive bill favors employers a great deal, but they just don't have the juice to stop it. They just don't. The mainstream Democratic Party is going to say, "Shut up and go away." We have to lock down the Hispanic vote, and we have to do that by protecting their interests on a big scale. There are people in the Hispanic community who are fairly far to the left on this issue as well, and don't think that any of this stuff goes far enough in protecting their interests. But similarly, they just don't have the juice to win that argument. Labor has actually worked with the chamber, and it's a very rare thing in American politics, to come up with a package of compromises that are now realized in the Gang of Eight bill.
That is rare.
It's very rare. So labor and the chamber are on board with this, and each of them had to take some things they did not like. And I think that this is sort of the mainstream folks saying, none of us are getting what we want, but we cannot tolerate the danger of the uncertainty of this situation any further. We'll take some hits and we'll move on. So I think it's a little bit easier for Democrats. I'll tell you one little political thing that's sort of funny that the Democrats will talk about is that Hispanic voters are quite heterogeneous in the United States, and Democrats won 70% of their vote last time. And I think a lot of it is because of the sometimes extreme sounding rhetoric from the Tea Party right. And there is an awareness on the part of Democrats is that if we get this comprehensive immigration reform, that it might actually undercut the ability to lock down that Hispanic vote.
Very possibly.
So it's similar to the civil rights movement as far as that's concerned, where people have to decide, do we want to do what's right, even though the cynical ploy might be to let the thing blow up again, blame it all on the other side.
In large part, I think that's what you're hearing, or what's driving Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio, whereas, again, this is something very important to the Obama administration, but they think that this is going to benefit the Republican Party long term.
Right, and to give them their due, I know both Senator Rubio and Governor Bush are quite sincere about this. I mean, they are personally very much appalled at what they see as kind of racist rhetoric from some of their own friends, and I've talked to Senator Rubio about this before. So I know that there's a sincerity to that. It's not pure cynicism. But on the other hand, it's the right play for them politically. There's no question about it.
Before we dive into the different titles in the Gang of Eight reform, just a really quick, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, let's just hit on some of the, again, past presidents, some of the more recent past presidents that attempted to do something, and I think maybe you could just point out that they were not able to get a winning coalition among some of those different constituencies.
And so one of the, again, being a little bit of a political scientist, not a political person, one thing we have to remember is that the constitutional design does not just anticipate left-right conflict, it actually establishes and sets up executive-legislative conflict.
Right.
So from the very beginning, the executive has wanted to be more active in enforcing the laws. Back in the Eisenhower administration, tried to crack down on border enforcement, and they were undercut by the Congress, where the employers would go to the members, particularly the agriculture sector, would go to members and say, hey, these guys are sending out these patrols, they're interrupting our labor flow, pull that back, and they would use the budget to do it. People talk about the Immigration Reform and Control Act that President Reagan signed in 1986 as being a failure. A lot of what the failure was about is that the bill itself was comprehensive, it had a lot of rich features in it, but it was always underfunded and in some cases never enforced. And almost immediately, President Clinton, again, from the executive standpoint, wanting to be tough on enforcing border security, they started raiding sites of employment on the interior. Immediately, employers came in, put pressure on members of Congress. The budget was cut.
I think a really important point. So let me again underscore it in that I think rhetorically, and there's a broad perception, a widespread perception out there that this is in a way a federal state issue. The federal government just is refusing to do their jobs in enforcing immigration policy, and what you're telling us is this might be less of a federal state issue, and it's more of an executive legislative issue where the executive essentially does want the federal government to do what it's supposed to be doing, but different interests or constituencies get at their congressional representatives and again, they kind of undercut those efforts.
It's not so much left or right, it has to do with specific constituencies. And just to give you an example, when I lived in Iowa back in the late 80s and early 90s, the packing houses were breaking the unions, and they hired illegal immigrants to break the unions. And they went from $15 an hour jobs to minimum wage jobs. The federal government tried to enforce immigration law by going in there and getting those illegal immigrants. And the congressional delegation in Iowa, Democrats and Republicans both, came in and backed up the Packers and said, leave these people alone. And that's really just an illustrative of the dynamic, is that Congress, for constituency reasons, not ideological reasons, have undercut the enforcement of immigration. And I like to tell people that, the system we have is a mess. It's reprehensible, it's disgraceful, it violates the rule of law, and it is not an accident. It is an accumulation of choices that were made by people with vested interest and power, and that's how we got to be where we are. And you can't blame immigration attorneys or this group or that group or liberals or conservatives. It's good old-fashioned interest group politics working its way through Congress, and that's just a fundamental feature of our system.
Our president's predecessor, George W. Bush, I think sincerely and legitimately wanted to leave his mark on the president that actually was able to comprehensively put through an immigration reform policy. It never got off the ground.
Right, and remember, he was from Texas. I think he received something like 70% of the Arab American vote. He received almost 50% of the Hispanic vote. He had a record of credibility on this score that I don't think that he has a racist bone in his body. I think he wanted to have comprehensive reform. But not only was it ground down by constituency politics, but also 9/11 really blew it out of the water, because at that point people's whole shift was towards security, and the idea that you would be coming up with any kind of program that would be sort of facilitating the flow of people across that border just didn't look like a political winner.
Bad timing,
right.
Real bad
He was actually on a trip to Mexico to visit President Fox to start designing the immigration reform when 9/11 happened, and that was the end of it.
Let's move on to the Gang of Eight proposals. So here we go again. I think it was clear in terms of, I think, both the administration as well as I think the Democratic Party and the Democratic Congress, that immigration was something that they wanted to tackle. Once President Obama was reelected, in some of the talks that I did in terms of sizing up what we're going to see, I mean, I put immigration right at the top. It's clear that this is something that they want to get done. The approach, this is not being sort of pushed by the administration or it's being championed, but not necessarily pushed. You have a Gang of Eight, a bipartisan Gang of Eight. There's some heavy hitters, both Republicans and Democrats on that committee, including Senator Rubio from Florida and Jeff Flake from Arizona. Again, geography matters here. Have put together a pretty broad, comprehensive proposal. It's right now, this week and next, being debated by the Senate. Let's break that down a little bit. There are 4 major titles, but I do think the first 2 are probably the ones where most of the action is, and that's Title I dealing with border security, and the second title dealing with the legalization process and what really to do with the 11+ million undocumented workers. Talk to me a little bit about what are they planning or what do they want to do on border security?
Okay, so border security is an interesting one. First of all, it's not a well-acknowledged fact for sort of interesting reasons that border security in the Obama administration has really ramped up. The size of the Border Patrol has vastly expanded. Prior to President Obama and through, the percentage of people trying to cross who are apprehended has gone way up. It's now about 60%, and that's up from 30 and 15.
And he's not endeared himself to some of the more harder core among the immigration reform, or the Hispanic community. I think he's been overly harsh in terms of
the irony of this is that he has no political incentive to brag about this because it undercuts support with a key constituency, and his opponents have no incentive to acknowledge that he's actually accommodated this. So we've actually made a good deal of progress on border security. Nobody really has any incentive to admit that that's true. This bill would be the greatest expansion of border security about the Southwest of anything we've ever done. Well, it increases the budget gigantically. It increases the number of fences gigantically. It deploys technology across the border region. And one of the things that it does is very significant, that it mandates that the federal government hit a 90% apprehensive, they've got the metrics for how you measure this. 90% of the people coming across that border have to be apprehended prior to any of the more generous features of the bill in allowing people to get on a path to citizenship. And this is a major accommodation to the Tea Party people. Now, there are going to be some folks, I think, who will simply say no, 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 no. It has to be 100%, and it has to be border security first. But when you think about the real world of politics, the real world of the complexities of policing a boundary that far, a 90% goal is a pretty hefty thing. And you're talking about...
And how do they measure that again? I'm just curious. How do you measure the ones that you miss?
That is a very complicated thing. And I think these honestly, I couldn't give you exactly what the algorithm is. But they have improved it. So they're up to 60%. You know, in the old days, they would tell you these number of people are coming across the border, and you would ask them, well, how do you know? Since by definition, a lot of people are getting across that you're not catching, and they'd say, well, it has to do with the number of people we're apprehending, and we're assuming we're getting this percent.
So you're still using proxies and extrapolations.
Yeah, and then the worst thing is that when you correlated the number of apprehended to the budget of the effort, it was a very high correlation. In other words, it may have had nothing to do with how many people were actually coming. It had to do with how many people you're employing catching them. So they've gotten a lot more sophisticated on this stuff, and I think most people do believe that they're better at it. But enforcement goes way up under this bill, to the degree that again is where some people maybe on the left end of the spectrum think they have gone too far in accommodating that as a central feature.
We're going to get into the legalization process in a second, but I know my understanding there's still, in terms of amendments and resistance, has a lot to do with the border security. Are they fighting on the right over substantively more border security, or is it all a sequencing thing in terms of, again, not starting the legalization process until you hit the metrics?
Well, there are various people arguing, there are different wrinkles in the various different amendments that are going to be coming. But one of the positions that I think the really hardcore people are pushing is 100% before you do anything else. Just both from somebody who studied this a long time without a big stake in it, but also as an advocate for reform, I think if you establish
100%, how do you get it?
If you establish 100%, there's nothing in life where you get 100%.
No.
You're going to go into the brain surgeon and he's going to say you need to have this surgery. You say, is it 100% or else I'm not having it? He'll book tickets to the funeral because nothing's 100%. And so that's one where personally I get a little bit suspicious that if you set a 100% standard, that you may be trying to kill the bill because you're not getting 100%. And if you really have robust measures, 90 is pretty darn good for government work in any sphere. And so there are people who are pushing 100% before you do anything. Others, I think, are really arguing about sequence, and I think they're a little more. You take them a little more seriously as not just trying to say no. And because look, in politics is one of the cynical things. It's very often better to have the issue and lose than it is to accomplish something. And so for a small group on either end of the spectrum, but particularly on this one on the right, you'd rather lose the issue and continue to be able to harp on it. And so, and that's true with a lot of issues on both sides. You go ahead and lose, and then you look like Joan of Arc to your people, and they think you're great. I think most people are coming around to realizing that while the details matter, you've got to have a compromise on this. So the enforcement is a huge measure on this, and I think one of the things you're hearing in the rhetoric of the proponents is that you cannot seriously purport that you're in favor of increased border security and vote against this bill because it's the best thing you're ever going to get passed out of Congress. And it has metrics. So there is a requirement to report on how well you're doing. So the onus is going to be on Congress to actually improve if it fails to work.
Talk to me a little bit about the legalization process. So we have over 11 million estimated undocumented workers or illegal aliens in this country. What's going to happen to them under this bill?
Actually, the answer is not a whole heck of a lot very quickly. Okay, so the way that I would characterize it is that they have a path to citizenship if they jump through a lot of hoops. So as far as their formal status is concerned, if they do everything that is required, first of all, the Congress has to certify that some of the border security things are working. Then the legalization features go into effect. They have to pay fines, they have to pay penalties, they have to pay back taxes. They have to get in the back of the line on as far as the quotas for people from certain countries are concerned. The average person would probably have to wait somewhere in the range of 12 years. In many cases, these people have already been living in the country for 10, 20, 30 years. Many of them already have American citizen children, other close relatives.
But they're not deported.
But they will be in here legally. I think you can honestly say that you're now living under the rule of law. There was an interesting article just today in the New York Times about the impact that a trial program has had on some people under an administrative rule made by the Obama administration about some DREAM Act kids, where they've tried them out and said, okay, you're now here legally, we're giving you some documentation. Their employment prospects have drastically increased. Their participation in school and other employment training programs has drastically increased. They just feel better. Crime rates are down. All of this because they're not living in the shadows. And I think that's one of the strong arguments in favor of this. You're not giving anybody, it's not amnesty. Nobody's getting a gift. You're not getting a letter in the mail saying, show up to take the citizenship test, you're in. You have to pay the penalties and so forth. But you now have some kind of legal status. And both from a practical and psychological impact, it means that your commitment to the country goes up a great deal.
Let's just take a moment. I want to just pull out the DREAM Act part of it for a second, because that, as a standalone piece of legislation, there was certainly momentum during the first administration. It got close, but it didn't get done. That act certainly resonates here in the state of Florida. It's been folded in, I think, as a component now to this comprehensive legislation. But just maybe in a minute or two, what is the DREAM Act, or what was it?
Well, it applies only to people who were brought into the United States in their minority, and different versions have a different cutoff year. Sometimes it's 16, I think, is the present bill. But you were brought here by your parents. So you were not making the choice to break the law by coming into the country against the law. You have to qualify, and again, there have been different versions of it, serving in the military, being accepted to college, so on and so forth. So you were brought in not through any fault of your own. You've never been in trouble. You've been paying your taxes. You've been going to school. You've served in the military. You will be able to naturalize your status. And I think that really, I'm a political theorist by trade, and one of the things about that if you just look at how political theory works, moral theory generally, is we tend not to punish people for things that they had no agency in making the decisions. You don't blame people for your parents' mistakes. It's a big accomplishment in the history of Western culture is when we started to say, we want to hold people responsible for their actions, not for their moms and dads. And I think that's really sort of the moral basis of this. If a kid was brought here when they're 7, they have no home to go back to. They've grown up in this country. They're Americans for all intents and purposes. They've gone to school. We've invested in them. The idea is they should have a quick and easy pathway to citizenship. Many of them have served in our armed services and have done well. That's one of the specific paths. So that is folded into the bill.
That subgroup, again, there was an initiative a little over a year ago to pass legislation that dealt just with that subgroup. It didn't pass, it failed, but that now has been made a component of the legalization title under this comprehensive reform bill.
And I think that's going to happen one way or another. I think. Now, here's I'm trying to.
We get ahead of ourselves about ripping the bill apart, but
and also I want to make clear where I depart from just sort of being a political science professor who's studied this and somebody who has some political opinions. And on this, I have a political opinion. I think it's very bad for any country to have a class of people who are below the rest of the people. The United States has been distinct after the 14th Amendment and then when women were brought in, of having one class of people. Under the law, you have one rank. You're a citizen. That's it. And you're going down a dangerous path when you say, we don't care what the circumstances were. We don't care that it was no fault of your own. We don't care that you went to our schools and participated in our economy and have paid your tax and have done a good job. Somebody in a previous generation made a mistake. You now never get to be part of this country. I think it undermines the rule of law, and I think with those people who didn't make a mistake, it seems to me sort of a no-brainer. I understand why people who want adults who made a choice to break a law to pay some kind of a penalty. It shows respect to the rule of law, and I think that's appropriate, and this bill also has that as well.
Now, I think we've hit on probably the two most salient titles of the bill or sections, the legalization process for those that are currently here that are illegal or undocumented, and then the border security issues. But if you look at simply the text of the bill, we're less than 50. Within the second title, there's also changes that are being made to the legal immigration process for those that are already, the legal track. And then there's another 2 titles dealing with sort of more internal security measures and e-verification system. Just maybe a couple of the things that you think from those other parts that are not receiving as much attention, but you think are fairly salient.
Well, I think the e-verification part is going to be emerging in the news cycles over the next few weeks as a key component of this, and just as a bargaining chip for the whole thing, and I think a crucial part of the whole bill. So to explain that, I've always thought that the key to this whole thing, we get very upset about people crossing the border illegally, as we should. I don't sanction that. But all of those people come here to get a job. And the vast majority of employers who hire them ought to know or strongly suspect that they're here without sanction. In many cases, there are schemes for employers to help people get phony Social Security numbers so that they won't be prosecuted for hiring somebody and not paying Social Security tax. So we need to start holding employers responsible as well. On the other hand, there's such a crucial part of the economy that the idea of just shutting them down and saying no more of these people working would be a devastating thing.
Sure.
So what the e-verification process is about is to provide employers with a reliable way of ascertaining the legal status of any person that they might hire. And it's pretty comprehensive because you don't want them just focused on people with Hispanic surnames or dark skin or something like that. Essentially now everybody who gets a job can be certified. There's going to be a lot of fight about this, and it has lots of interesting dimensions. Right now, because of some other things going on, there's a renewed concern about the relationship of citizens to the state and the ability of the state to comprehensively gather and collate information about us. I think that's an issue that sort of unites people across the political spectrum, from far right libertarians, far left libertarians, and moderate civil libertarians are very suspicious about the ability of the state just to gather vast amounts of information. E-Verify is a crucial component for this whole thing to work. If you're really going to be saying we're not going to be hiring huge numbers of illegal immigrants, you don't want incentives to be there to hire those people, and we don't want incentives for them to come. You really have to close down the ability of employers to get them, because if they keep giving people jobs, people are still going to come here to get them. I don't care how hard you try to close down the border. But I think now there are going to be more questions asked about how is this E-Verify thing going to work, and how are we going to maintain surveillance over every single human being in this country. And those questions are going to be more salient. I think there'll be a lot of bargaining, a lot of pushback from employers using some of the concerns. So I think that's going to be a hot button issue. The work program itself, where you're for these people who, particularly in agricultural labor but in other service labor, I think the features of that program, and essentially what we have is we're going to be introducing a quasi-guest worker program.
Right, and that's another important part.
And I think the details of that have yet to be, people have sort of set that, both E-Verify and that, aside while they fight over these other two. Now that they're getting clarified, I think those things will come to the fore, and there are some real issues there. And personally, I mean, if I were up there working on this, I think that they would be really challenging issues, not clear-cut. And you've got constituency politics involved, and then you have issues of real principle involved as well.
So this week, the Senate took up the bill, and we were expecting, I guess, substantive arguments, and it was an interesting week. They didn't get very far. They were peppered with amendment requests in a not so coordinated way, and I don't think there was even agreement on what the voting process would be, both sort of timing and packaging, or even thresholds for considering amendments, let alone some of the more substantive parts. So it was a bit of a messy week in Congress. The one part I just want to come back and get your thoughts about that, because I had a chuckle at some of the irony. There's not agreement yet on whether or not, we know how it's going to end, but whether or not the threshold for an amendment to be included and accepted to the bill, whether that would be simple majority in the Senate, 51 votes, or whether it would have to actually overcome the filibuster, as just about everything these days does. And you see an interesting little role reversal between Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell on that. Give us the skinny on that.
Well, I mean, I think you summed it up pretty well, and I think it's this whole thing is indicative of how broken Congress is generally, because as somebody who studied immigration policy as it emerged from the 1880s to the present, it was never an issue that required, even the 65 and 86 acts, the two biggest immigration acts of the 20th century or post-war era in any case. They worked their way through his committee. And then they came to the floor for a vote, and then that was it. And there was deal making well behind the scenes, well in advance between the two versions, between the houses. So there wasn't a whole lot of conference. Now you see the process is so conflictual, and there are so many fights going on at several different levels about what the procedures can be and ought to be, and then they spill over to everything else. So it's not just about the immigration bill, but if we make a deal on this one about how the procedure is going forward, coming to the floor, what's that going to do for future deals? And it really is an indication that the whole legislative process is broken down in a lot of ways, that procedures themselves become the fight, and people hate that.
No, the routinization of the filibuster plus the procedural fights have been...
And so this is it. I mean, it's a big deal for our country. And the nice thing is I think that if moderates come forward and say, we're getting this deal because we've got to move forward on this, we can do it. But you have this sense that, to use the technical language, there are so many veto points that getting even a moderate, short-term, comprehensive deal is fraught with danger at every, because we haven't even talked about the House. And so
we will in a second.
So we've already had one vote where 70% of the senators went along with it, which seems to clear,
to get us started in terms of the debate.
So it sort of lays it out by saying, look, we can get there because 70 people are already on board. They've already taken the vote. So they're already taking the hit of the negative ads or something on TV. Certainly we should get through here, and we can't count on it because they're going to be fighting about what the cloture rules are. And we haven't even started the fight in the House, where I think actually prospects are a little dimmer.
Right. Just to reiterate, I think that really important point, broader politics, I think what we've seen, again, is emergency procedures, again, in the form of the filibuster and other procedural moves that sort of blocking something from just coming up to votes and debates have been used so frequently. We're seeing, almost a breakdown in business as usual that everybody seems to recognize. Yet on every issue that comes up, most folks are on one side or another. And whoever is an opponent of a piece of legislation cannot help themselves, and in terms of invoking all of the procedural hurdles that were just invoked against them. And until at some point, I think we can kind of, for the sake of the nation, roll back some of these, again, procedural roadblocks. It's going to be very difficult to get anything done. There's so many different veto points.
And I agree with all of that. But there is one thing, and if people want to read into this a political shot, they're welcome to do it. And I've been fairly apolitical in this discussion. But there is a place for courage in politics as well. Mm-hmm. And I think particularly on the House side, if some moderate Republicans would come forward and say, we want to see a comprehensive immigration bill that is a compromise, get through this House, that could make it happen. And what a lot of the moderates are doing is they go back to their district and they throw red meat out to the Tea Party people and talk about English only and how bad immigration is and so forth. And then they go to the Latin Chamber of Commerce and say, I love immigration, I'm all in favor of this. And then they hope that the whole thing gets ground down procedurally so they never, ever actually have to take a vote. So at the next election, they can go to these different constituencies and say, I was on your side all along. Mm-hmm. If a few of those people would step out front and say, no, this has to be done,
But there's clear risk to that politically.
That's why I say it takes courage.
Risk that hasn't been there in past decades.
Right.
The chances of being pushed from your base in a primary when you're a well-established. Part of the trick was you get in there, you establish your creds, and then pretty much you can again work on figuring out where in the center you're going to, or at what point you're going to moderate and compromise to get things done. Now, you always have to worry almost every year and cycle about again, not falling in step with your
incumbents cannot say, I'm not of Washington, and then behave like cowards. If you're really up there to make things change, you got to take a few risks, and you got to have some guts, and you've got to show some courage. And in this particular story, the key people in the entire process are Republicans who think of themselves or present themselves as moderates. They can make this thing happen by simply banding together, take 5 of them, 3 of them, to say, we're going to go to the mat, we'll risk the primary from the Tea Party candidate. This is important for our country, and if they do that, this will go forward.
Let's look at the timeline right now. Again, the House Republicans are gearing up to consider. Let's see where we are mid-July. The Senate wants this done before they go on recess for the 4th of July weekend. So we're in mid-June right now, coming up on Father's Day. We're 2 days away from Father's Day, and again, this week was not exactly the most productive week in terms of vetting this bill. What do you think the chances of them actually, within a time frame of about 2 weeks, getting this through the House? I'm sorry, getting this through the Senate.
You're a political scientist like I am, and so the first thing you always ask are, what are the incentives? And I do think that the leaders in the Senate, even Senator McConnell, have an incentive to get this thing through. So they have the ability to set the rules in such a fashion as to get the thing done. So I think they can get this done by their own deadline. If they don't, I think you have to worry about whether the thing ever gets done. I'm a lot more skeptical on the House side because I don't see where the incentives are. I think it's a very tough one for the leadership. I think Representative Boehner would just like to see this thing just go away.
I think that's an ironic point in that for a number of perhaps the more moderate, or even, I wouldn't even call them moderate, but within sort of squarely straightforward Republicans or conservatives, they in many respects, regardless of where they are, don't want to see it get out of the Senate, because then if it doesn't get out of the Senate, then it's their fault. It's how could you point at us when you couldn't get your own act together?
Well, and as you know, in our system of government, there are all these veto points. Bills can die at many different points. So if a bill comes over from the Senate, if the House never produces a bill, then nothing ever comes forward. And so there have already been signs that the group in the House side who have been working together on a bipartisan basis have hemorrhaged a few members over the last couple of weeks. That's a very gloomy prospect because it's not coming out of a normal committee process. Mm-hmm. It's just not. The committee won't produce the bill. Now, since Gingrich was Speaker, often the party really comes up with the bill and slams it through and just tells the members they have to pass it. But I don't think the House leadership has the capacity to come up with a bill that would be a compromise that in turn would survive a conference committee with the Senate. So it really has to be a compromise bill, and it really has to be pretty similar to the Senate bill to end up being an actual bill. It's just too easy to kill the thing without anybody's fingerprints being on it.
Is it safe to say that with respect to a bill being passed by the Senate, it's more a matter of when as opposed to whether? I mean, they might not get it done before recess, but it's not going to go away, is it? I mean, they're not going to give up on this thing. There's just too many heavy hitters with so much invested in it.
And I think for that reason, since they know that it's eventually going to happen, they probably will get it done on a timely basis. I'm just guessing, but that's my gut feeling on it. One of the things about it's one of the just problems we have with the way legislatures work in this country, at state as well as federal level, is that there are a lot of incentives to be a chicken, to be cowardly and evade a vote. And it's one of the impacts of negative campaigning. But the fact is, they already had the 70 vote victory. So all the negative ads are already teed up. Mm-hmm. They've already paid the cost. So they might as well just pass a bill. They're going to get bombed if somebody in their state doesn't like doing this. You don't have to be on the prevailing side to be held responsible. And in fact, with negative ads, it doesn't even have to be true, but they'll just make stuff up. But on this one, they've already paid a cost. So I think that they will get something finished, and they might as well get it finished.
I saw Michelle Bachmann was out there saber rattling, I think a day or two ago, in terms of trying to awaken the troops in terms of putting on a sort of a resistant force. Call your local congressman, get those Tea Party folks in terms of trying to slow this thing down or stop it.
This is an issue of great passion, and I think one of problems you have with this kind of a bill is that the bill itself, as you pointed out earlier, it's a very complicated bill. And it is a compromise. So there are all kinds of features in it that somebody isn't going to like. But it's a matter of great passion for maybe a quarter or a fifth of the population.
And I want to again underscore that the point about comprehensive legislation, which is often the way really big, important things get done, but the courage that it takes to do that, to sign on politically. Because when you have a bill of this scale and this scope and this range, there will not be a single member of Congress or any even member of the administration that will look at it and say, I like each and every component and element. There are going to be some things in here that I support, and there are going to be some things in here that I don't like. And if you vote for it, you will always have voted for the things that you profess that you don't like, and or if you don't, you'll probably always say, well, there were certain things that I do like, so don't hold me accountable for not voting for the parts that I did like, because they're the ones that I didn't like. So I think as we at the outset of the top of the program, I had mentioned I really think this is going to this is not just a summer issue. This is really going to shape some political cycles. Would you agree? With that? This thing, it's not going to go away, and even if it falls apart, I don't think folks this time, because there is more skin in the game, I think, are just going to sweep this under the rug and move on to the next issue. So I think where you stand on this piece of legislation and what you have to say about it, it's going to certainly shape, I think, the congressional midterm races, as well as, again, some of the presidential candidates right now have
I think some fundamental changes also, because one of the things about this bill is I think that because it's the immigration issue, it does not fit very neatly in the traditional left-right basket. And some of the people on, the well-mobilized and well-organized people on the right, I think, are going to assume it's a straightforward issue, and they're going to find some people who they ordinarily would regard as allies deserting them, and that's going to be interesting to watch. I think a transformational aspect of it, and you see this in our own community, is that Hispanics, Mexican Americans, people from Latin America, first and second generation Americans, are mobilizing themselves. One of the things about that component of the population is that election rates among Hispanic folks have not traditionally been very high. They voted much higher rate this last time. They voted 70% in one direction, and now they're taking to the streets and they're getting active. And that can change the balance going forward, not just the next cycle, but the next 5 cycles.
That's almost, it's a double dose in terms of that, the demographic shift. So that unlike, I think, probably if you take the Hispanic community and Hispanic voters, they traditionally, at least over the last few decades, have had the lowest turnouts rates of any sort of major ethnic or demographic, or a major ethnic group here in the United States. And so if their numbers are growing in the absolute sense, but they're also turning out in higher numbers in terms of their turnout rates, then they just become much more potent.
Right, and the way people are politically is that they tend to reinforce the framework that they have. So here's the big deal. If this generation of young people coming in, Hispanics and their friends, define themselves as Democrats because the Democrats are more strongly on their side on this, they will start listening to Democratic sources and interpreting the world in the terms that the Democrats, and it'll have a cohort effect. In other words, that generation will be stamped going forward, and they'll tend to be more Democratic than they might have been otherwise for generations to come. And I think that's the reason why folks like Marco Rubio are saying, wait a second, we've got to do something about this. We cannot allow ourselves to be labeled as the anti-immigrant party going forward. And that's the window that's opened up for real change here.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the, I think this is one of these issues you were exposed to a few as a state legislator, that even though the legislation it's federal legislation, you're not going to be able to run for cover even in the state and local races, again, just because it's so significant. People are going to want to know, and it'll be pretty easy probably to take that national issue and localize it in some respect in terms of campaigns. We're just about out of time. We've got more to do on this issue, on this program, and on this series. But in terms of wrapping it up, maybe you could just share with our viewers what are some of the things that they should probably be focusing most of their attention on again in the next month or two, as again, a bevy of press reports come out on this. What do you think again are the most important or key key dimensions of this process in the next month or two?
Well, as I already indicated, I think people in this local area, we have a couple of representatives who are in a unique position to actually step forward and play a leadership role. I don't think they will. But I think sometimes in politics you have to pay attention to silence or hedging as well as leadership. So I would encourage everybody to watch their own members of Congress and see what they're doing. Because we have some people here who could actually make a difference on this. And like to present themselves as being influential legislators, and I see them ducking the issue, so I think that's fun. I think you have to watch the House especially, because that's where you see the storm clouds forming that would really throw this thing off. And I think people ought to allow themselves to think broadly about this, because one of the reasons I got interested in immigration policy as a graduate student is that it really is a policy that has the long-term effect of defining who we are as a people. And so the mundane, fight it out, gritty political debates of today determine who we are and what we think of ourselves, how we define ourselves, what our values are, who we want as members, how we define what membership is. Do we define it on racial grounds or ethnic grounds or religious grounds? Or do we define it in terms of embracing a certain set of political values and virtues? And all of that is actually taking place in a really concrete way in this fight, and I think it's fun and important to think about that as well.
Thanks, Keith.
Thanks.
That about does it for this segment. I'd like to thank METV for taking this initiative to produce the series, and I'd like to thank Dr. Fitzgerald for helping get us started. Be sure to tune back in during the coming weeks for additional programs on economic impacts and law enforcement issues. As I noted at the top of the program, we will culminate the series with a panel debate on the Gang of Eight legislation. Thanks for watching.